So, it's funny, we were just sitting down here kind of chatting about not reading or how much reading you do. So I'm about to read you something, and I will warn you I didn't finish it. So it's going to have a mysterious ending. So I'm glad to see the really full room today. I suspect that's because our guest tonight has drawn colleagues from other buildings across this cold campus. So particularly for those who have come from elsewhere, thanks for coming out. So for you all, I guess, I'm Todd Gannon. I'm the head of the architecture program here at the Knowlton School. And I'm really super happy to welcome Caroline Levine, this year's Baumer Distinguished Visiting Professor, to the lectern tonight. Caroline comes to us from Cornell, where she's the David and Kathleen Ryan Professor of the Humanities. She holds a degree in Comp Lit from Princeton and a PhD in English from Birkbeck College at the University of London. Prior to Cornell, she was professor and chair of the English department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and before that taught at Rutgers and Wake Forest universities. She wrote her first book on suspense in 19th century literature in 2003. And at this point, you're probably wondering what the hell she's doing here speaking at the architecture school. She may still be wondering this, but we had a really great session today with our graduate students. And I would say, part of it is me. I read her book and I really liked it and I thought she should come. And I do think that, the main reason has to do with not just one, but her last two books. Provoking Democracy of 2007 and her award-winning, more recent book, Forms, of 2015. In Provoking Democracy, Caroline flips that familiar claim that avant-garde artists often rely on the freedoms afforded them by democratic states. You can't be avant-garde if you aren't protected by the state in some way. But she flips that to make a much less obvious, and I would argue more important claim, that democracies themselves need, not just allow or support or tolerate, but need challenging avant-garde art to propel the cause of freedom. In Forms, she develops her thinking on these topics and on the relationship between cultural production and political justice by making another seemingly counterintuitive claim, that formalism, that long ago discredited close reading, those long ago discredited close reading tactics associated with the new critics of the first half of the 20th century, might be recuperated as a method not only for gaining insight into current literary texts, but also for provoking meaningful social change through literary and cultural criticism. Now, the lessons that these books have to teach us extend well beyond the disciplinary boundaries of literary studies, and that's really the reason that I felt it was very important for her to come here. Like Caroline, we architects, landscape architects, and city and regional planners have a vested interest in the relationship between artistic production and social justice, and if you don't, you should. And the formalist techniques of close reading, detailed description, and careful attention to complex organizational structure, the kind of stuff that we do every day in the seminars, are the same kinds of tricks, tricks is not the right word, but it's the same set of methodological techniques that Caroline deploys in her book. And so really, in a sense, the kind of literary expertise that we'll see tonight and the disciplinary expertise that we kind of attempt to conjure in this building are really cut from the same methodological cloth. So I started to kind of lay out a whole kind of exposition of the relationship of architecture, literature, and formalism, and the history of the school as part of that. We ran long with the seminars today. I didn't get a chance to finish it. It's probably for the best. It would have taken a long time. I may I'll write it as an essay or something sometime. But at the end of the day, I would say, even though Caroline's coming from another field, I think she really speaks the same language that we speak. And so she may be trained as a Victorianist, but she's a formalist by disposition and an activist at heart. And I think those are the qualities that you should be paying attention to tonight. And so with that, please help me welcome Caroline Levine.
It is such an honor to be here. I really am so moved and flattered and thrilled to be speaking in a way so far outside of my usual wheelhouse. And I do hope that there's lots of productive discussion that we can have. Some of what I'm going to present to you is guesswork about what we might have to talk about together. Some of it is my own recent work that I'm trying to think through and would love your help in continuing to think about in productive ways across fields. So I started by asking the question, what happens when someone who's trained to study novels and poems stands up in front of a room full of people who know how to design buildings and cities? And I started to think about what kinds of crossings and harmonies and ruptures and maybe rifts we might make possible here. But my own deepest intuition, which is what Todd has pointed to, and I think is right, is that we share, that is literary studies and those who practice and study architecture, we share a commitment to thinking about what I've been calling forms, that is the work of imposing shapes, patterns, and arrangements. The materials we organize are, of course, very different. On the one hand, spaces, on the other hand, words. But both writers and architects deal most fundamentally in form, in working the flux and chaos of the world into various kinds of order. Now, this might seem like such a basic and general claim that it risks being banal. Don't most human endeavors, from engineering to music to finance, involve the imposition of order? And my answer is yes. I think they all do. But I don't think this is banal. I think it might have some pretty significant consequences that we think across these many disciplines, these many ways of working and thinking. If we think form across all of them, we might be able to work together in new kinds of ways. So I want to suggest that something important might happen, that when we notice that across so many fields within the university and outside, scholars as well as practitioners, humanists as well as scientists, designers as well as politicians are all working in this common medium of form. So I want to talk about two major reasons to focus on form today. The first has to do with politics. I think we have a shared responsibility to think about how all kinds of forms, from urban spaces to labor laws to sitcoms, produce the arrangements that govern the ways we live together, what the Greeks called the polis, and the word that we get our own term politics from. When it comes to politics, I'm going to focus particularly on sustainability, which I think of as the most urgent problem of collective life that's facing us now. How do we live together in the polis? And I understand a bunch of you third-year students are working on that problem also. The second big reason to pay attention to form has to do with how we in the university understand both the possibilities and the limits of the knowledge that we generate. So I want to make a case for a particular version of interdisciplinarity, one that focuses us especially on the limits of the forms that we study and use. Not just on their possibilities, but also on their limitations. Okay, so the talk today has three parts. The first is a general set of questions about politics and form, why we should think about the relations between politics and form. Then I'm going to focus in on sustainability as a problem and project. And finally, I'll turn to interdisciplinarity. So first, why should we think about form as a political matter? I want to start with a really broad political claim, and that's the claim that the value that has most often motivated major political movements over the past many decades in the US and around many parts of the world has been freedom. It's a value shared by right, left, and center, although they certainly define what they mean by freedom very differently in these different parts of the political spectrum. But certainly since 1968, if not before, both the right and the left have shared a desire to free people from the power of the state, the official power of government. On the left, which is where I stand myself, and so I'm going to focus most today, although I do want to think about the question of freedom across the political spectrum. But I am myself interested in certain versions of social justice that belong very much to the left. But on the left, to be political has often meant to resist the status quo, to fight against oppressive institutions that preserve all kinds of powerful hierarchies. So leftists refuse social and sexual norms and boundaries. They want to free people to experiment with new kinds of selves and relationships. Think how radicals have celebrated terms, and this is especially in the academy, but also sometimes outside, like liminality, rupture, break, excess, resistance, openness, singularity, and anti-normativity. These are all terms that are about breaking with the status quo, about rupturing experience as we know it. So radical thinkers across schools of thought in the arts and the humanities, from post-structuralism to post-colonialism to queer theory, have been seeing their goal, their basic aim, as the unsettling of dominant structures and arrangements. They want to cross boundaries and resist categories. For the French political philosopher Jacques Rancière, only the disturbance counts as what he calls politics. Anything that settles things back into order, he calls the police. So, and there's a very definite value judgment between those two. Disturbance is good, the police is bad. We don't have to look far to see the impulse to disruption and negation on the right also. Right-wingers have long fought for government deregulation and free markets. And Trumpism is nothing if not a smashing of norms and rules and the formal work of governance. Even centrists will agree that they're protecting, first and foremost, the kinds of freedom enshrined in the US Constitution and especially in the Bill of Rights. Freedom from tyranny, freedom of speech and assembly, freedom to pursue one's own beliefs and values without intervention by the state. All right, left, right, center. Freedom is so taken for granted that I think we don't even see it often for what it is, which is one value among others. I'm going to make the unfashionable claim here that across the political spectrum, across right, left, and center, we've been making too much of freedom. We've been thinking of politics only as churn and resistance and negation. And what's important for my purposes here is that I see this impulse to freedom as first and foremost a resistance to form, to order. And I think the anti-formalist impulse is preventing us from building the social worlds that we may actually really want. So in my recent book, which Todd mentioned, called Forms, I define form in a very deliberately broad way as any shape or configuration, any arrangement of elements, any ordering or patterning. And politics, as I understood it in that book, and still understand it, depends on forms. So political power operates through spatial containers and boundaries, like nation states and domestic walls. So we have constant arguments in the public sphere about who belongs where. Do working class crowds belong in the public square? Do women belong in voting booths? But politics isn't only about organizing or imposing form on space. It's also about organizing time. So think about prison terms, naturalization periods, and the legal age for voting rights, military service, and sexual consent. We know, too, that politics means enforcing hierarchies, white and black, masculine and feminine, straight and queer. So if you take these together, my claim is that the political involves activities of ordering, patterning, and shaping. Politics is all about distributions and arrangements. Or maybe to put this in a slightly clearer way, politics is the work of giving form to collective life. Now, it's certainly true that many political forms, including racial hierarchies and national borders, are oppressive and violent. And it's because of forms like these that so many thinkers have pushed for breaking forms altogether, especially lots of radical thinkers. They say all forms should be resisted. The implicit logic goes something like this. If forms are intrinsically constraining, and if we understand politics as disruption, then we must smash and unsettle forms wherever we find them. Or, to put this in my own terms, the embrace of freedom as the primary political value has brought with it a deep anti-formalism. So my claim is that the dream of freedom from all forms of order is at the heart of most political movements in the US and many around the world today, a kind of deep libertarian impulse that is shared across certainly many on the right and the left. But here's the thing that bothers me. I think this impulse to freedom goes against something we also know about living in common, which is that collectives always entail forms of social organization. Humans as a species have always been interdependent. We've always needed to figure out how to live in groups. We've always had to figure out how to organize and distribute resources and practices, including the shared labor of maintaining and reproducing bodies, including the production and preparation of food, care for infants, the ill and the elderly, and arrangements of space for shelter and gathering. No human community has ever been free from orders or arrangements. So if there could be no politics, no collective life without orders and arrangements, this means that the goal of politics can't be freedom from form. A working politics has to involve understanding, deploying, and designing orders and arrangements. In my own recent book on form, I spent a lot of time thinking about how forms collide, disrupting and rerouting one another. Now I'm starting to see this as very much in the spirit of so much other political work that's been concerned with subversion and resistance, the project of freedom, that is, how to unsettle forms. So recently I've been wondering what a leftist politics of social justice would look like if we saw our main task not as smashing and resisting oppressive forms, but as designing and building political orders. We wouldn't be trying to do away with constraints, but instead, and here I think architects are some of the people who do this best, we would be thinking about how we must always work with and through and inside constraints. We would think about whether some arrangements, some distributions of space and time and resources are more likely to afford justice and equality than others. What forms could we imagine, design, and build that would give shape to a just society? So this is to put architecture at the center of the question of politics. And this brings me to the second part of the talk, which concerns the question of sustainability. In this moment of climate crisis, when disruption and unpredictability are the terrifying new norm, I've gotten particularly interested in political and social forms that would be focused on preserving and sustaining collective life over the long term. So, while for a long time the left has been focused on radical change, on taking apart oppressive structures, what climate change has made suddenly clear is that now it's really urgent to preserve and stabilize. Conservation is certainly not only for conservatives. Actually, conservatism is not only for conservatives either anymore. I also want to broaden the leftist definition of sustainability beyond environmental values alone. So I care very much about environmental sustainability, but I want to think about sustainability as a term that encompasses a lot of different ways of sustaining political collective life over time. So sustainability refers to the general task of maintaining collective life over generations, over time to come. This could mean envisioning lasting systemic alternatives to current inequalities, such as ongoing wealth redistribution, job security, food security, and reliable shelter for all. For the poor and the vulnerable, security and stability are often crucial goods. Desiring shelter, writes Susan Freeman, is not necessarily conservative either. Freeman reads a passage near the end of Stone Butch Blues, a novel about a working-class transgender protagonist who creates a home after a long period of homelessness. She paints, cleans, buys linens and bath soaps at a department store. Critics have typically written off home decorating as weakly feminine and consumerist, But Freeman urges us to see justice homemaking as a crucial piece of the struggle to survive. Quote, an audacious effort to produce a basic sense of physical and psychic security by someone who's been repeatedly violated, who has never in her life felt truly safe. So taking my cue from Freeman, I want to recognize first the psychic and social costs of demolition. That is insecurity, violence, loss, and fear. That is what comes along with smashing existing forms. And from that point, I want to begin to imagine how we might nurture stable, just forms of collective life for the long term. Since most leftists have been focused on the disruption of the status quo, I think we haven't developed good tools for understanding how things last over time. Our most common explanation is ideology. A system of beliefs and values keeps things in place. But how does that last? How does an ideology stay in place? How is it that certain ideas, practices, and organizations manage to last across generations while others fade or crumble? It's very clear that some social arrangements do last. They do have staying power. White supremacy and patriarchy are particularly sticky. They've lasted well after they've stopped being official institutions. They're still organizing the fabric of our ordinary lives. So this has become a question for me. Why do some orders and arrangements, why do some value systems stick around? It's clear that some orders and arrangements are likely to last when they take robust material shape, like buildings and roads. But here is my own developing hypothesis. Less substantial, more ideological social forms, like racial hierarchies, last when they operate in some kind of self-reinforcing system with these other more durable forms. That is, when built forms and ideas like racial hierarchy work together in self-sustaining systems. I'm going to turn first to the example of redlining, the US government practice of defining certain neighborhoods as too risky for banks to invest in them. So this is going to be my example of how built forms and ideological forms work together to sustain each other over time. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration guaranteed loans only in neighborhoods occupied, quote, by the race for which they are intended, and where local schools should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. So very clearly ideological law with very clear racializing principles in it. This law then prompted the building of mostly white suburbs. Redlining then shaped other forms, like the construction of mass transit systems that link downtowns to white suburbs but bypass minority neighborhoods. So racism, which begins this process, then organizes other social forms. Racial hierarchy, if we take it to be a form, first separates neighborhoods by race, then it directs the connective routes taken by roads, mass transit, and clean water, which then entrenches and deepens poverty and inequality in the redlined neighborhoods. Which then feeds a cultural myth of white superiority. Why can't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps? Why are they still in those poor neighborhoods? So these work together to feed in a kind of formal feedback loop, to feed back into the ideology that begins them. So at first, redlining was a federal program, but then private banks took a cue from government policy and also denied loans to prospective homeowners in Black and Latino neighborhoods. And the results for African Americans and Latinos in the States have been pretty similar across the country, from Seattle to Columbus to Philadelphia. Even long after redlining became officially illegal, minority neighborhoods are still cut off from good transportation, high quality education, and labor opportunities. And this keeps racialized poverty going. So the hypothesis here is that clusters of interacting forms sustain a racist order across US cities, carrying with them predictable consequences in almost every context where they go. Now, you might say that the persistence of racial injustice is exactly why we need to fight forms and systems. But I want to take the argument in the opposite direction and make the case that the portability and the durability of this formal model has a valuable lesson to offer to those working for social justice. If we understand how forms work together to reinforce one another over time, we might be able to develop our own better, more just models to take the place of the unjust ones that are in place now. Constellations or systems of forms that could reliably, predictably, and sustainably produce and reproduce equality. So, to that end, let me offer a more hopeful case than redlining. It's the city of Belo Horizonte in Brazil, called the city that ended hunger. A leftist government in the 1990s developed policies to guarantee food as a right for this city of more than 2.5 million people. It had very high rates of child malnutrition and mortality at the time. Belo Horizonte introduced not just one program here and one program there, but 20 integrated solutions, which they called a food security system. Elements of the system include nutritious school meals, subsidies for fruits and vegetables, designated sites where small local farmers are given access to produce stands to sell directly to urban consumers, training programs for bakers and chefs, seed distribution to school and community gardens, and licenses for food trucks to move around the city as long as they spend a certain amount of time in poor neighborhoods, selling fresh foods at a fixed low price. Probably the best known of all the programs has been the so-called popular restaurants. These restaurants serve high quality, locally farmed, nutritious meals at very low prices, and they're set up in a kind of pub-like atmosphere, sometimes with live music. A lot of people who eat there come from the middle and upper classes, so the point of making high quality meals and having this nice, pleasant atmosphere and centrally locating these restaurants is that it deliberately doesn't stigmatize the poor. It brings in lots of different people. So side by side at long tables, you see students, the elderly, professionals, and the homeless all eating together. When Belo Horizonte first started its food system, lots of people said, it's never gonna last. This is just dependent on this particular administration. As soon as there's a different political order, a different political will, it's gonna collapse and disappear. But now it's been going for more than 2 decades, and scholars have started to pay attention to why it's staying in place. What is it that makes it endure? As with redlining, the system is sustainable in part because its different formal elements work really well together. They reinforce one another in a kind of formal feedback loop. So consider the Straight from the Field program. According to this program, small family farms near the city get government support for growing fruits and vegetables, and they have to grow them in certain environmentally sustainable ways. That's mandated by the program. And then they sell directly to urban consumers at designated public sites, whatever they've produced. So there's a public process for determining which farmers are eligible, but which farmers are eligible is based entirely on the income of the family and the size of the farm. So it's small, poor family farms that get access to this program. The government then sets the sales prices. So a bunch of important forms are at work, what I call forms are at work here, including standardized, regulated sizes and prices, direct sales locations, so certain sites in the city, and a transparent public selection process. Another form, the network, also plays a really important role here. Belo Horizonte deliberately locates these sales sites, the places where you can buy the fruits and vegetables, in really busy urban spots where otherwise fresh food is really scarce. So it's like 2 different networks overlaid on top of each other. Human hubs, where there's lots of human activity, food deserts, where there's very little fresh food that you can get. I noticed when I was thinking about Chicago that the food deserts in Chicago are actually map onto the redlined neighborhoods in Chicago. And I don't know, because I don't know Columbus well enough, I'm not sure that the same is true here. But those of you who know the city might be able to say whether somebody's just tried to map the food deserts in Columbus. Whether they map onto the redline neighborhoods is also really interesting, right? Because then you can see the history of these forms continuing in other kinds of ways. But anyway, Belo Horizonte deliberately located the farm stands at this crossing of human hubs and food deserts. And what's been really important is that the various forms of the Straight from the Field program reinforce one another. So city dwellers get access to high quality fruits and vegetables at low prices. Rural farmers have the chance to make a decent living, and that's really important because if they don't, if they fall under the poverty line, they'll migrate to the urban shanty towns, which then becomes a cost on the city. So if they stay on their farms and keep producing food, the city doesn't have to support them. So that frees up more resources to put back into community gardens or school food programs. So the city has used some of the money it saved by keeping people on their farms to train gardeners and chefs and so on. So great news is, overall, health, income, and environmental sustainability and nutrition have all risen in Belo Horizonte since the 1990s, and it seems to be still going strong. So the interlocking forms of the food security system work together to sustain each other over time. Now, I've been calling it a food security system. That's the term that the city itself uses. But I just want to point out that security is a term that we leftists usually hate. It's a term that's not even in our vocabulary. We associate it with terrible repressive police and defense forces. What I'm suggesting in this talk, that's kind of the core of the problem that we have for social justice. We've thought so often of terms like security, stability, predictability as the enemies of social justice, that now when if we want to think about something that can sustain itself over time, we need to re-embrace these terms and we need to think about how to make them happen. So it's a new way for me to think not only about necessary elements of political experience, but also desirable elements of political experience, that we may want the predictability and the stability of food security systems where we may not want national security or security forces in the same ways. So instead of stressing the excitements of radical freedom on the left, we would be exploring a new and paradoxical kind of radicalism that values the building of stable and stabilizing forms for the long term. Now, of course, it's not hard to imagine how architects and urban planners could be crucial to this work of building sustainable forms for justice and stability. I, in fact, have been asked several times when I've given these examples in English departments and other literary contexts, whether I'm really asking everybody in the room to become an urban planner. And the answer is, of course, no, because that would make too many urban planners, and you guys need jobs, those of you who are training in that field. But it's very clear that I am wandering away from my own home discipline of literary studies, and probably to some of you it seems arrogant or familiar or even downright foolish of me to think that I have anything to say about urban planning to the group of students and experts who are gathered here in this room. But this is the thing, that the kinds of questions I've been asking can only prompt me to range across social and aesthetic forms, because they crop up across different pieces of life. They're not confined to one discipline or another. So I want to spend the last section of this talk reflecting on why I think this kind of interdisciplinarity, and particularly an interdisciplinary thinking about form, is worth doing, despite the very real dangers of ignorance and superficiality that attend any attempt to cross back and forth between different fields like literature and architecture. So that brings me to the third section of my talk, which is why should formally minded thinkers, like many of you and like me, work across disciplines? Why is interdisciplinarity of value? Now, a lot of people would say, well, part of what interdisciplinarity does is to bring our expertise that we've developed deeply in a given field to a collective venture, right? So we want to think about politics. Architects and urban planners will bring one set of knowledges, and literary critics will bring another. I have a different way to think about it, and that's what I want to introduce to you here, which is thinking formally across these disciplines, and from that reflecting back on the limits of what each of our disciplines does. So the first reason that I'd like to think about ranging across fields is that some very simple basic forms, like say the binary or the hierarchy, are organizing social worlds across many different sites and practices, from law to religion to art to empire. If we step back from the ways that each field approaches its materials, we could engage in a kind of meta-disciplinary thinking about these shared forms across these different fields and practices. So one of my own more unpopular claims in my own field context has been that forms are portable and generalizable. They move across media and across contexts. So for example, rhythms can organize a piece of music or a heartbeat or a group of workers. Rows can organize a beehive or a theater or a classroom. And I learned from design theorists that as forms move, they carry with them certain generalizable capacities, what in design theory, and I believe architects have their own term for this, but cognitive design people call affordances. So a given design or a given material will afford certain kinds of activities or practices, and it will foreclose others. So for example, a dining table affords small-scale conversation, eating, paying bills, maybe writing a dissertation. Some of you may be doing that. It doesn't afford mass spectacles or marches. You can't do that with a dining table. Hierarchies afford gradations of importance, and they can be reshuffled, but they don't really afford resolution like drama or flow like liquids. Affordances, like forms, are capable of traveling across contexts. So as each form moves from place to place, it'll take its affordances with it, always able to do some things well and others badly or not at all. So part of what I'm saying is that I think forms do move across the kinds of things we separate into different disciplines in the university. They can show up across multiple disciplines. And I also think that we can use some of the same formalist methods to analyze both aesthetic and socio-political forms. So on the one hand, the novel affords plots of marriage and maturity. And on the other hand, the public square affords visible mass gatherings, including protests. So we can use the same formalist vocabulary or framework to think about these very different kinds of forms. So thinking formally allows us to cross different domains of experience to understand how each form does a certain kind of work in each surprisingly different context. So, here's just one example that feels resonant right now, and that's the form of the border. We can obviously analyze the work done by the same form of the border in architecture and in political science. But in fact, the form itself is a common structural problem that both fields are thinking perhaps differently. So can they inform each other about the work of the same form? Now, what each form can't do has come to seem increasingly important to me, especially when it comes to interdisciplinarity. So I've started to be concerned that we tend to take the constraints of our forms of knowledge too much for granted in each discipline. So it can be hard when you're working within a discipline to see the limits of the forms that you're using and the possibilities that other forms might afford you that you haven't been considering. So for example, if you're used to working with big data sets, you're going to be thrilled to spot big general trends, but you might well not spend time thinking about the limits of the forms that you've used to organize and communicate your knowledge. So for example, let's look at this bar graph from the Congressional Budget Office, which shows the average gains and losses in US incomes between 1979 and 2007. Now, what's great about this graph, I think, is the incredible contrast it registers, right? The huge gap between the incomes that have lagged for the bottom 4/5 of the population and then skyrocketed for the top 1% of the population. The graph uses color both to set off the top 1% as a separable category, so it's actually part of the top fifth, the top 1%, but also to foreground the startling difference between the 1% of the rest, and there the color red probably signals like emergencies or stop signs or something that carries meaning beyond simply the difference in color. So what graphs like these are best at is tracking patterns across large numbers. So they condense vast quantities of specific examples, people, jobs, dollars, in one stark, immediately apprehended comparison. What it doesn't do, for example, is give you any sense of why inequality has grown, what forces have led to this growing gap. It doesn't invite us to think about what obstacles prevent a given household from moving between wealth brackets, or what outliers might do that make a difference. That kind of knowledge, it seems to me, is much better handled in narrative form, the telling of stories that unfold over time. I began my own academic life, as Todd mentioned, as a scholar of the British novel, and I love and have always loved the fact that the Victorian novel focuses on problems of social inequality and poverty. And I continue to admire the ways that the novel affords particularly a sustained attention to what it feels like to be poor, what kind of the daily, constant hardships of poverty are like. And so we often say that the novel builds empathy. I want to say it actually produces a different kind of knowledge. That is, a knowledge of what those obstacles and hardships are is not contained, for example, in this bar graph. But over the years, I started to see the novel as having kind of limited affordances for thinking about poverty in certain ways. Because of its forms, it does certain ways of thinking well and other ways of thinking badly. So I started to want to pay attention to the limits of the novel and to think about both what political questions it does really well and how other forms we might need also to help us think about certain aspects of the polis. So one really wonderful critic in my field named Alex Wallach has pointed out that the 19th century novel democratizes its characters. He's not the only one to point that out. Instead of just focusing on princes and kings and gods and goddesses, in the 19th century, pretty much anyone can become a major figure in the novel. You can have a major character who's a prostitute or a thief or an orphan or comes from nowhere. But on the other hand, Wallach argues, the characters that the novel gives its attention to are almost always very few in number. It can only focus on one or two protagonists. Everybody else falls away into the background. So some novels experiment with a few more major characters, but typical form of the novel is to have a few major characters, everybody else becomes minor. So Wallach argues that this formal point about character has political implications because our attention to the few comes at the expense of our attention to the many, the collective. As he says, any character can be a protagonist, but only one character is. So what forms might be better for helping us to think collective experience? If the novel isn't that good at getting us a sense of collective community experience, the problem of living together, the many, what would be better at capturing that experience? I want to spend a little time here with another book from the Victorian period, which is not a novel, and which I don't expect most of you to know, although I know there are a couple of people in the audience that do know. It's a book that helped me to think about the limited affordances of forms and the importance of thinking across fields for thinking forms. It's an 1851 book, although it was a result of a bunch of serialized articles, called London Labor and the London Poor by a kind of oddball guy named Henry Mayhew. He was somebody who dabbled in lots and lots of different forms in his own life. He was a journalist, he wrote novels, he performed chemistry experiments, he wrote several plays, he founded the satirical magazine Punch, he wrote children's books and cheap pamphlets and educational treatises. This is his most famous book. And what interests me in this book is that he kept experimenting with forms through the book in how to represent the poor, and especially the poor as a large body of people. How do you capture the huge experience of the London poor? So one form he returns to again and again is the statistical chart. So he estimates how many pounds of fish were sold in a year on the street, how much ham sandwich sellers sell on average, how much a bunch of flowers costs on Sundays. So he keeps coming back with tables. We might call that the Mayhew of big data. But like a lot of humanists working right now, Mayhew suggests that numbers alone don't actually give you all the information that you need. He wants us to understand what it feels like to be poor. And most memorably, he includes first-person accounts in the words of workers on the streets themselves. And this is now thought to be Mayhew's most radical and most influential idea. He says, his is the first attempt to publish a history of a people from the lips of the people themselves, giving a literal description of their labor, their earnings, their trials, and their sufferings in their own unvarnished language. So these voices are something like the opposite of big data. They focus our attention at length on a single person's experience. Mayhew asks workers to describe their labor conditions and their home lives. One of his most famous subjects is an 8-year-old girl who sells watercress on the streets to survive. She says, "I bears the cold, you must, so I puts my hand under my shawl, though it hurts 'em to take hold of the cresses, especially when we takes 'em to the pump to wash 'em. No, I never see any children crying, it's no use." So these vivid first-person accounts afford not the large scale, but the specific perspectives of struggling individual people. Mayhew says explicitly that he wants to counter the dominant middle-class assumption that the poor are responsible for their own hardships. Continues to be a common assumption today. And this kind of textured account of the obstacles and hardships that an 8-year-old worker faces is much more effective for that purpose than the lists of numbers that he's also including. And of course, he implies that he needs both of them. He includes both of them, both the sympathetic perspective of the suffering individual and a recognition that this suffering is happening on a large scale, which we see in the chart. Now, what's really interesting to me about Mayhew is that even these two very different forms don't quite satisfy him, and he starts experimenting. For a while, he presents his interviews with London poor people as dialogues between himself and individual Londoners. And in fact, the watercress girl is one of those that he interviews. But then he starts to include long monologues entirely in the voice of the worker, and he takes out the interviewer's questions completely. So here's one example. An old blind street seller says, "My husband was a costermonger, and we didn't do well." "Oh dear, no, sir, because he was addicted to drinking." Now, this is the kind of example, and there are lots of them in the text, where clearly the interviewer has asked a question, but we don't see what the question is, and the interviewer's question has been erased. So the form Mayhew adopts is not a back and forth dialogue, but a monologue where a first-person speaker addresses an audience who is there but doesn't speak. One of the reasons this form matters is that it's going to stick around for a really long time. Mayhew is now credited with inventing a technique that's a staple of sociology and the other social sciences. That's the ethnographic interview. He's the first to interview poor and socially marginalized people at length about their own experiences, beliefs, and values, and to communicate this in their own words as a valid knowledge of the world. So why this new form? On the one hand, it's a monologue, one person speaking. On the other hand, it's not really solitary. We're kind of aware that there's an interviewer there, even though the interviewer isn't saying anything. So it's a form that combines individuals and a social context, individuals and a kind of collective, quiet collective that is interested in their lives. So it allows Mayhew to join his pretty radical project of allowing poor individuals to speak with his project of never forgetting the social context for any individual experience. Now, a lot of people say that Mayhew is novelistic. You can read him and you get some of the experience of reading novels. And in fact, he influenced all kinds of novelists, including Dickens. But he's pretty deliberate about abandoning two of the most important forms of the novel, and those are protagonists and plots. Unlike the novel, which focuses on a couple of major characters and everybody else is minor, he just gives us one after another, after another, after another. The list is potentially endless of his characters. Each one is as important as the next one. So it's a bunch of equally important people who follow one another in the series. No one is the center. Then when it comes to plot, the series of voices he gives us, it's plotless, it's potentially endless. There's no shape or arc to it. It doesn't conclude in any kind of conflict. So his series of monologues, in theory, could expand to include absolutely everyone. And in fact, the book ended up being 5 volumes, but he was still wanting to work on it after those 5 volumes. So it was, in a sense, couldn't come to an end in that way either. But the reason I think that Mayhew turns away from plots and protagonists is that neither one is quite democratic enough for him. Plots focus too much on a particular outcome or particular end, and he wants to give us a big picture. Protagonists focus us too much on the single person. He wants to give us so many individuals that we don't have a sense of just focusing in. So the last form that I want to talk about with Mayhew is even the ethnographic interview form. He didn't always satisfy him, so he starts to introduce yet another form where he collects a whole crowd of people in a room and he asks them questions about their experience. And let me read you just a little selection from one of these. A lad about 20 was here about to volunteer a statement concerning the lodging houses, that is kind of poor places where people sleep, by which he declared he had been brought to his ruin, but he was instantly assailed with cries of, "Come down, hold your tongue," and those became so general and were in so menacing a tone that he said he was afraid to make any disclosures because he believed if he did so, he would have perhaps 2 or 3 dozen of the other chaps onto him. Great confusion. "Mr. Mayhew, will it hurt any of you here if he says anything against the lodging houses?" "Yes, yes." "How will it do so?" A voice, "If they shut up the lodging houses, where are we to go? If a poor boy gets to the workhouse, he catches a fever and is starved into the bargain." "Mr. Mayhew, are you not all tired of the lives you now lead?" Vociferous cries of, "Yes, yes, we wish to better ourselves," from all parts of the room. "And do not the parties who keep these places grow rich on your degradation and your peril?" Loud cries of, "Yes, yes." So in this passage, the crowd is obviously not an ideal collectivity. The majority are deliberately intimidating the poor guy who's trying to volunteer information to the interviewer in the very first part of it. But Mayhew still points us to the specific affordances of the crowd as a source of knowledge. He's always been interested in getting individual voices to speak, but he also knows that there are limits to that because they may be too partial or not representative enough of the group that they pretend to represent. So the joining of many voices in a single space allows him to give insight into the dynamics of the group itself, including the intimidating expression of mass feeling like desire and fear, and the desire to silence outliers and whistleblowers. But he also gives us the perspective of conflict, of different perspectives on this same experience, and with large groups answering the questions. And of course, as you probably noticed, the text here starts to read an awful lot like a play. Mayhew seems to be borrowing the form of the dramatic script. And this makes sense formally. He's trying to reveal the limitations of both particular persons and the angry crowd. Neither is adequate, so he thinks we need both in a kind of tense and unresolved dialogue where everybody gets a chance to speak, but nobody comes to any conclusion. So no form is better suited to dialogue, probably, than drama. So with Mayhew, we move toward an understanding of collective life through a deliberate heaping of very different forms: statistical tables, ethnographic interviews, and dramatic scenes. In our university today, our disciplines typically divide these forms from one another. We put statistics in one department, drama in another department, ethnographic interviews in yet a third department. But what if we need all of these forms to capture the experience of the collective or the problem of poverty, for example. Statistics won't allow us to understand the struggles of the 8-year-old girl selling watercress on the bitterly cold London streets. But on the other hand, we won't know how systemic or widespread that poverty is unless we start gathering large numbers. So I want to suggest that Mayhew's gathering of many forms for understanding collective life might be valuable for us today because our disciplines don't always recognize the limitations of their preferred forms. We might argue for qualitative over quantitative analysis, or for practitioners over theorists, or for the sciences over the humanities. But in fact, all of these forms have both capabilities and limitations. They have affordances. Each form of knowledge allows us to think certain thoughts while hiding or obscuring others. That means that our disciplines are, in a sense, producing certain forms that replicate their own limitations over and over again, and yet we may not, from within the discipline, be able to see those. So I'd like to make a case for a slightly unusual version of interdisciplinarity. It does draw on what other people have said about working interdisciplinarily, which is that we need the work of many disciplines to address urgent global problems like climate change and inequality. But I'm also proposing that we turn to a specific kind of meta-disciplinary thinking that is a formalist analysis that allows us to see the contours of each discipline's forms of knowledge, including what each form prevents us from knowing or thinking, as well as what it's good at. This might push us, like Mayhew, to combine or borrow forms from other disciplines, or to develop new forms out of the ones that we're already using. So finally, this brings me back, my last minute or two, to literature and architecture. In my own field, we've often celebrated art as best when it breaks rules and frees us from oppressive systems. But I think artists know as much or more about rules and constraints as they do about freedom. Poets and novelists think in and through constraining forms, as do painters and composers, and of course architects and filmmakers, and even academic writers. All of us struggle to craft understanding and meaning with and by way of forms. And since living together requires constraints of all kinds, including the fact that we have to share space and organize time, we have to distribute labor and resources, a focus on constraints is essential to politics. So we in the arts and design fields, I think, are perfectly poised to think about constraints in a way that's not only about limiting our freedom, but about enabling life in common. We're among the people best able to imagine and build systems of interlocking forms to sustain collective life over the long term. And no task, it seems to me, is more urgent right now than that. Thank you.